A 20-year-old Palestinian man has died in an Israeli prison. Musab Hassan Adili was detained in Nablus in the occupied West Bank last year. Rights organizations have long warned that Palestinians are subject to horrific conditions in Israeli prisons. Prisoners' rights organizations Ademir says roughly 2 in 5 Palestinian men have been arrested and nearly 10,000 Palestinians are held in Israeli prisons. 400 are children, 27 are women. 3,500 are under administrative detention, held without charge or trial. Former prisoners report beatings, torture, starvation and humiliation. Since October of 2023, Israel has banned humanitarian visits, making it even harder to assess the conditions and exact prisoner numbers.
Hello, dear listeners, friends, comrades, subjects, citizens, insurgents, fugitives, defectors, dissidents, even the haters and losers. Welcome to Turbulence. My name is Dylan Saba, and I'm here with my co-host, Seamus Malakafseli, along with our producer, M. Siniza. We're recording from New York City, the center of a world empire that is dying, but so far from dead.
Last weekend marked Palestinian Prisoners' Day, observed every year on April 17th since 1974. The date commemorates the release of Mahmoud Bakr Hijazi on April 17th, 1971, in the first official prisoner exchange between Israel and the Palestinians.
April 17th is a day of national and international solidarity, meant to make visible the conditions Palestinian prisoners endure under Israeli occupation. From administrative detention and torture to isolation, medical neglect, and family separation. But it is also a day that insists on the prisoner as the compass of the Palestinian liberation struggle, not merely a symbol of the reality of captivity, but a figure of steadfastness, resistance, and revolutionary possibility. In our conversation with Orisanmi Burton from episode 3, we spoke about the prison as a form of low-intensity warfare, a framework that Burton brilliantly develops in his excellent book, Tip of the Spear. In that conversation, we attempted to think through Black Palestinian solidarity by way of the carceral system, through the prison, through counterinsurgency, and the prisoner as a revolutionary subject. Naturally, that brought us to the work and life of Walid Daqqa. In today's episode, we return to Daqqa, who across 38 years in captivity produced some of the most enduring work on the carceral logics of the Israeli occupation. In particular, he introduced the metaphor of the small prison and the large prison. The small prison being the literal prison walls and direct carceral confinement, and the large prison, all of the ways that the occupation pulls Palestinian society into its carceral regime, through its impact on the families of the incarcerated, but also the way in which the Palestinian nation is literally fragmented and besieged by Zionist forces.
Daqqa died in prison on April 7th, 2024, as cancer ravaged his body, and whatever medical treatment given to him by the Israelis was, of course, purposefully insufficient. To this day, his body remains not in the possession of his family, able to bury him with dignity, but in the possession of the Israel Prison Service. Daqqa's case is one of many, emblematic of the conditions inside Israeli prisons that were already depraved before October 7th, but which have somehow deteriorated tremendously since then. Many were shocked by the condition that Fatah leader Marwan Barghouti, who many in the West have called the Nelson Mandela of Palestine, appeared to be in a video released by Itamar Ben-Gvir's office some months ago, the first time anyone in public had seen him in years. The purpose of the video was to show Ben-Gvir, in his capacity as National Security Minister, telling Barghouti that he will wipe out the Palestinians who, quote, mess with the people of Israel, unquote, and that, quote, you will not win, unquote.
To discuss this, the condition of Palestinian prisoners within the occupation's prison, the difference between the treatment of prisoners after October 7th and before, and the life and work of Walid Daqqa, we have the pleasure of speaking with Basil Farraj, the director of the Ibrahim Lughod Institute of International Studies and an assistant professor of philosophy and cultural studies at Birzeit University in Palestine. And just a note to our listeners, this was a very difficult conversation and covered a range of material that was, quite frankly, very difficult to listen to, including graphic descriptions of torture and systematic sexual abuse. So be forewarned.
Before we get into the conversation, we do have a pitch to you, the listener. Turbulence is entirely listener-funded. We don't run ads. We don't take money from institutions. And that independence is the foundation of this project. It only exists because of you.
Because we're committed to providing you the in-depth history and present context you need to make sense of each of these topics, these episodes take a great deal of time and effort to produce, from conception to research to editing. It's because we value your time as a listener, and because we want to produce something lasting and useful, that we think this level of effort is worth investing in. But that means we can't quite move as nimbly as we might otherwise like. So in addition to our free public episodes, we're also dropping weekly episodes behind the paywall. That's where we'll be able to respond to events as they unfold in closer to real time, providing our analysis, following up on threads and conversations from prior episodes, and drawing connections across the topics we've covered.
To do all this, we need your support. A $5 monthly subscription will give you access to the bonus feed, our Substack community, and most importantly, you'll make it possible for us to keep doing this work independently week after week. Subscribe today at turbulencepod.substack.com and follow along on Twitter and Instagram at turbulence_pod. We hope you'll join us. We are speaking today with Basil Farraj, who is the director of the Ibrahim Lughod Institute of International Studies and an assistant professor of philosophy and cultural studies at Birzeit University. Basil, thank you so much for speaking with us.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
I wanted to begin by asking about the death penalty law that was passed by the Knesset at the end of March, at least officially. And this may be surprising to people listening to this. The death penalty was not being given out to Palestinian political prisoners before this. And now there is this massive legislated expansion of death sentencing, which, at least to the Western press, the Israelis do not appear to be super willing to defend with the same kind of intensity that they did their conduct in Gaza, for example. Can you detail what precisely this bill is and how Palestinians have been responding to it?
Yeah, of course, this was not the beginning. There was numerous attempts before to pass the death penalty law. At the end of March of this year, of 2026, the law passed with the vote of 62 Knesset members, so parliament members, who voted in favor of the law, while 48 objected to the law. Now, what this law means, basically, of course, it's inherently racist because, it details that those who are sentenced with quote-unquote crimes of a nationalistic motive should be sentenced. Now, if we break that down, so the term nationalist in Israeli discourse, it almost certainly means a Palestinian. The law does not itself say that, it's Palestinians who would be executed or put to the death penalty. But the inherent nature of this law, of course, and the terms that have been used, and this has been widely reported by numerous Palestinian organizations, such as Adala, for example, or Ad-Damir, which is a prisoners' support and human rights association, is that, the law itself is, of course, it comes from the logic of the Zionist state. So this is always, in other laws, for example, that the Knesset has passed, or even if we think about the military orders that control the livelihood of Palestinians, in their nature, they're inherently racist and criminalizing of any form of Palestinian conduct and any form of Palestinian resistance, whether it be civil or political or armed resistance. So by its nature, basically, it's an attempt to criminalize, of course, any form of Palestinian resistance. But more than that, it's to put Palestinians on the death row, to execute Palestinians who are convicted of these, so-called the broad umbrella of crimes of a nationalistic motive. And while, of course, we look at it in a very bald way, this law, but we also understand as Palestinians that this is not the beginning. It's not the start of laws that criminalize and racialize Palestinians. Let's just recall that Itamar Ben Gvir, who's the Minister of Public Security, or actually National Security, he has been trying since the beginning of his election to the Knesset to pass this law. It was actually one of his kind of campaign slogans. The way I view this law, it's, in my understanding at least, of course, it's very appalling. Obviously, it has not been put into practice yet. But the way I look at it, it's just simply a continuation of the ways in which the Israeli regime has been treating Palestinians, but more specifically, Palestinians who are inside Israeli prisons. Let's just recall that since the beginning of the genocide, the Israeli regime has effectively executed at least 89 Palestinians inside Israeli prisons, whether it be because of a systematic starvation campaign, whether it be because of this brutal violence and torture that was unleashed on their bodies. So in a sense, what I'm trying to say is that, while this law, again, it has a history. Did not just simply pass near the end of March. There were numerous attempts before. It became a party slogan, actually, for numerous Israeli parliamentarians. But it also has a history of violence and torture where it's effectively actually being practiced upon Palestinian bodies without the law being passed. And just to note here, another important point is that we have to view this law within the broad set, as I mentioned, of other Israeli laws. So, for example, if we look at Israel is a Jewish nation state, for example, the Basic Law, it similarly has that inherent racializing and criminalizing aspect that actually tells us the true nature of this Israeli regime, where any act that's Palestinian, any act that's directed toward resistance, toward kind of social mobilization, political mobilization, or an attempt actually to work towards liberation is seen as a criminal act, and thus is worthy of punishment and violence. Now, how did Palestinians receive it? We're obviously distressed with the passing of the law and what it means, but I think we also understand that it's a continuation of these forms of Israeli violence that are already actually being practiced inside Israeli prisons. And I'm sure we'll get into this later on, but the reality inside Israeli prisons since the genocide began is simply, a manifestation of this death penalty. To have a prisoner who is sentenced for multiple life sentences with no ability to be released is another iteration of placing Palestinians in that near-death status where they're negated all their rights, not able to think about liberation or freedom. So I think it's obviously a criminal law, but again, it's a continuation of these Israeli policies that continue to target Palestinians.
So, if we're talking about the conditions in prisons inside of Israel, I and you, and I think many people listening to this have likely seen the videos from inside prisons that have been broadcast on Israeli television. I wanted to ask about how conditions have deteriorated since October 7th, and how were they before all of this? To what degree of freedom were Palestinian prisoners given, if any?
Thanks, Seamus. That's a very good question. If we look at the emergence of Israel's carceral regime since 1948, it has continuously been a place of a location of violence, of intensified violence and torture and denial of rights for the Palestinian prisoners. If we look historically, for example, those Palestinian prisoners in the early years of the Israeli prison were put into forced labor, for example. They were denied access to books, access to visitation rights. They were denied any forms of communication with the outside world, so denied, prison visitations by their family members or by lawyers. They were subjected to brutal conditions where overcrowdedness was the norm, for example, where limited portions of food was allowed to their cells. And also, of course, the brutal forms of violence and torture that was continuously practiced inside interrogation centers. Now, this is kind of the historic emergence of the Israeli prison. Violence and torture was never absent. Of course, the Israeli government and the previous, let's say before the genocide, for example, it had tried in a way to kind of present itself as a law-abiding state, as a democratic state. And I'll just give two examples. In 1987, there was an Israeli commission termed after one of its members, the Landau Commission, was tasked with reviewing which forms of violence and torture are practiced inside interrogation centers. And one of the outcomes of this commission is that Israeli interrogators, so the Israeli security agency, the Shabak, should practice quote-unquote moderate physical pressure and only resort to some forms of further violence when needed, when the state feels that it's at risk or that public security and order is at risk. Another example which continued that kind of attempt to legalize, let's say, violence and torture is the infamous 1999 Israeli High Court of Justice ruling that attempted to review also the ways in which Palestinian prisoners were tortured. And here there's a vast, multiple array of methods that the Israeli Security Agency would practice on Palestinian prisoners. For example, there's the Shabih method, which is hanging Palestinians by their hands to the wall, for example, and leaving them in that state for days and weeks and months. There's the practice of blindfolding Palestinians with a dirty sack, through which numerous Palestinian detainees would be subjected to this practice, left in cells by themselves with this dirty sack for days, again, weeks and months. There's the frog crouch example, which is another torture method where the prisoners are forced to sit in a specific posture that produces numerous pains to their joints and to their arms and to their body, as well, in addition to other methods, of course. So the 1999 Court of Justice ruling said that the Israeli state, it's a democratic state. It should not resort to these forms of violence and torture because, as a law-abiding state, it should adhere to kind of international norms and democratic norms, while stating at the same time in the same ruling that, the struggle against, quote, terrorism requires at certain times the resort to certain methods to protect, quote, public order and security. And here I just want to emphasize this term because it's always used in Israeli discourse. And the court's decision ended up by kind of, in a sense, legalizing torture through stating that, when the security agency feels that there's a need to resort to violence that exceeds the moderate physical pressure that I mentioned, then that's justifiable if it's for the sake of protecting public order and security of the state. And they used another term here, which is the ticking bomb scenario. If they feel that this detainee has information that would kind of, in a sense, save the lives of Israelis, then it's possible to exercise violence and torture. Now, why do I mention these examples? Because, this was a period where the Israeli government tried, in a sense, to legalize its methods of violence and torture through recourse to discourses on security, on public order, on democracy. In a sense, to present the Israeli state as a state that can manage the numerous allegations that Palestinian detainees would continuously issue against the practice of violence. Now, this is, of course, it was a very, very stupid, if I may say, attempt by the Israeli government because it continued to practice torture all the time against Palestinian prisoners. And this reality actually is the reality inside Israeli prisons before the genocide began. So I'll get back to your question now. The reality before the genocide began was, a reality where violence and torture are omnipresent. They're systematically being practiced against Palestinian prisoners, albeit, of course, in a controlled, perhaps, fashion. So we would hear stories about Palestinian detainees being subjected to brutal violence. Actually, one of them, for example, in 2019, his ribs were broken. His other body parts were severely broken due to torture. He almost died in the hospital. And this was like 3-4 years before the genocide began. And the Israeli government simply said that, we felt that this was a ticking bomb scenario, so we had to make recourse to violence and torture. But the overall picture of the Israeli prisons before the genocide began is that context of brutal violence, of brutal torture. While here, and this is the second part of my answer, Palestinian prisoners, since the emergence of the Israeli carceral regime, have continuously sought different methods of confrontation and resistance in an attempt to force the Israeli authorities to grant them their rights. So I described to you, for example, the early Israeli prisons where prisoners were not allowed access to books, to pens, to communication with their family members, for example. In fact, they were forced to address their jailer with the term, "Yes, sir." So in the early years of the Israeli prison regime, the prisoners would have to bow down and address their jailer with that kind of condescending fashion. "Yes, sir. Yes, captain." And prisoners, of course, understood this reality. So they embarked on these numerous methods of resistance to change that reality. They managed to force the Israeli authorities, for example, to grant them access to books and pens, to kind of change the dynamics of prison visitations. To allow, for example, for Palestinians to be able to visit their loved ones once every 2 weeks or once every month, when in the past it was not allowed at all, for example. They forced Israeli authorities to allow prisoners to actually cook their own food inside their cells. They forced Israeli authorities to allow them to enroll in education, for example. There were numerous prisoners who enrolled in universities in Palestine from the space of their captivity, or others who, for example, managed to enroll in their undergraduate degrees. And this was, of course, never a grant, it was never granted by the Israeli authorities. It was a product of decades of struggle where prisoners engaged in hunger strikes, for example. The example I mentioned from the early years of Israeli captivity, it was in 1970, for example, an infamous Palestinian hunger strike that took place in Asqalan prison, where Palestinian detainees, one of their demands was to end the policy of addressing Israeli jailers with the term, "Yes, sir," for example. It was an important and infamous hunger strike because it changed the dynamics of the prison system. And in fact, one of the first, if not the first, Palestinian martyr of the prisoners' movement was from that hunger strike. He was martyred because the Israeli authorities force-fed him, and then later on he died because of that act of force-feeding. They force-fed him because they were not able to manage that hunger strike. And I mentioned these examples just to say that, while, and I'll get into the reality now, while, of course, we hear about the current context of violence and torture and kind of the brutal Israeli war inside prisons, the reality before October 7th was not rosy, was not flowery. It was very difficult. It was painful for the prisoners. But they actually managed to assert some of their rights through these struggles. While, of course, we do hear about, and we did hear about, numerous Palestinian prisoners who were assassinated or executed inside Israeli prisons before October 7th. We also heard, we know the stories of Palestinian detainees who were sent to solitary confinement for months and years before October 7th. We also know the history of kind of the struggle between the detainees and the Israeli prison authority before October 7th. But what I'm trying to say here is that, the reality, at least what was different perhaps, is that Palestinian prisoners, despite all these forms of violence and torture and, of course, the brutal denial of rights prior to the onset of the genocide, is that they managed to create and to engage in numerous resistance practices. We would continuously hear about hunger strikes, for example, or attempts to boycott military courts. Or, for example, we would receive actually letters from captivity. We would receive books and literature that prisoners produced from their spaces of confinement. Now, after October 7th, again, I just want to stress that, we have to view this historically in a way, that it was never, that the Israeli regime was always violent. It was always attempting to kill Palestinian detainees. But I think what happened after October 7th is that the Israeli government, of course, the Israeli ministry that's in charge of prisons, so Ben Gvir in that case, and of course the broader kind of public, the Israeli public, in my understanding, they managed to find kind of the perfect opportunity to unleash a war on Palestinian prisoners, not only to rid them of the rights that they actually earned with blood, from their own blood and their own kind of sweat and struggle, but they found that opportunity that allowed them to at least an attempt to break that collective nature of the struggle that prisoners fostered in the decades before the genocide. And I think that was perhaps one of the most kind of important achievements of the prisoners' movement. And when we say a prisoners' movement, that's what it means. It's a movement. It's a political movement that prisoners have managed to foster, to create, and to kind of force the Israeli authorities to recognize them, even if not legally, as political prisoners. Not as, the Israeli government would always kind of refer to them as security prisoners that attempt to racialize and to criminalize Palestinians. But after October 7th, again, the Israeli government, of course, as we witnessed the kind of the onset of the brutal genocide, the Gaza Strip, and of course, the transformation of the West Bank into kind of these further cantonized areas and kind of the unleashing of violence across the West Bank, of course, is that they unleashed this brutal violence as if they had an agenda already in store. They just took it out and they began implementing that agenda in an attempt, primarily in my understanding, to break that collective nature of the Palestinian prisoners movement and to return them to kind of a situation that dates before the emergence of the Israeli carceral regime. And to be honest, I've heard this from numerous prisoners. At the beginning of the war, and I remember this very clearly, at the beginning of the genocide, released prisoners, or at least some of who I managed to kind of, speak to in convoluted ways while they were in captivity, they would describe the nature of the Israeli prisons at the beginning of the genocide as very similar to the late 60s. And later on, as the genocide continued, they said actually that the situation actually is very different. It's novel. They had not witnessed a situation that actually, and many of them have lived through these different decades and different history. They had not lived a situation that resembles what's taking place now. And I'll just give an example. So when the genocide began, on the first day, actually, the Israeli authorities began these measures. And what did they include? At the beginning, they included and this is what prisoners always tell me, the first thing was to shut the access to television. And then they began confiscating their belongings. What did their belongings include? A radio, their books, the photos of their family members, for example, their notes. And then they started these different policies that attempted to isolate prisoners entirely from their community. They began to place Palestinian prisoners in total isolation. Many of them, for numerous months since the beginning of the genocide, were not allowed to leave their cells for any minute. I've had interviews with former prisoners who told me that they were stuck in this very overcrowded cell for over 6 months. So imagine a cell that actually used to house in the past 6 Palestinian prisoners. Today, it has between 10 to 12 Palestinian prisoners. In addition to that, the Israeli Authority began to systematically reduce the amount of food that's allowed to enter into Palestinian prisoners. They actually calculated, as the prisoners tell me, the portions that are provided to prisoners. Perhaps in an attempt just to keep them barely alive, they embarked on a systematic medical denial campaign where numerous prisoners were denied their medical care. And let's just recall that many of the Palestinian prisoners today are ill and sick, and they have serious health conditions. In addition to that, the Israeli authorities until today have banned any form of communication with prisoners. So I mean here family communication. They denied family visitations. So we're talking about, over 2 years and a half where the families of detainees have not been able to hear or see their loved ones. In addition to that, the Israeli authorities denied access to the International Committee of the Red Cross. And they began exercising the most brutal and grotesque forms of violence and torture. Just to mention a few examples. Entry with dogs, where prisoners were attacked with dogs in their cells. The use of stun grenades. The use of rubber bullets. This has never happened in the past. Forcing prisoners to continuously bow down when they walk in the cell. They have to sit down when the guards come in to count them. Shackling them all the time. And of course, we'll get into, the situation of detainees from the Gaza Strip later on, perhaps. But so the reality is that this intensification of forms of violence that reached every aspect of Palestinian prisoners' lives inside captivity. Today, we're talking about a situation where the cells are entirely empty. They have no access to any forms of communication with their family members, no books, no notebooks. They're stuck in their cells. Today, they're allowed perhaps 45 minutes of courtyard time, but this is nothing because even the courtyard time, and here I must say this to the listeners, the Israelis drew a yellow line inside the space where prisoners were allowed to walk in the past. So they restricted the courtyard space where they are allowed to walk. They drew a yellow line, and if any prisoner dares to step on that line or to move beyond it, they would be violated, tortured, and they would receive forms of punishment. So basically, the reality today is, and that's why I described it as a war, because Israel has unleashed a war inside Israeli prisons. Let's remember here today that also at least 89 Palestinian detainees have been killed since October 7th. This is a very large number, actually. And many of those prisoners were killed because of beatings, because of torture. Some of them because of denial of medical care. Let's just recall the case of Walid Daqqa, for example, who was sick with a rare bone marrow cancer. The Israelis denied him medical care. He was shackled in his hospital. They refused to release him even though his condition was dire. And of course, they continue to withhold his body captive to this day. So the reality today is really violent. I think it's perhaps, and here I'm just quoting Palestinians who I've spoken to, prisoners. It's a reality that's unparalleled. And I think to understand it, we have to understand that this is the nature of the Israeli regime. That this violence, perhaps for us, it's shocking to hear these stories. They hear the stories of sexual assault, for example. And to be honest, I've had testimonies with prisoners, detainees from the Gaza Strip, for example, who would tell me that some of the detainees were forced to sit on a pole, on an iron pole. Or for example, others who would be forced to stand in front of each other and to perform sexual illustrations to sexual acts in front of the guards. Or I'll give you another example where one of the prisoners told me that during one of the days, a guard who he named, because he was brutal, He said that he entered the cell and he ordered them, of course, because once the guards enter, the prisoners have to kneel on the floor. They have to sit still in a position kind of curling their bodies. And then they took them out of the cell. And then when they returned, they found out that the prisoners had kind of created this kind of a bowling alley where they placed some cups on top of each other. The guards threw soap on the floor and they started throwing their bodies as if they were a ball towards that kind of tower of cups in an attempt to imitate a bowling game. This was the guards doing that. So the reality is extremely brutal. Again, the Palestinian prisoners have been denied all of their rights. And I think one of perhaps the most brutal of those rights is the fact that they are forcibly placed in a condition where they are entirely isolated, no news comes in, where they have no communication with their family members, where they have been placed in a kind of forced starvation campaign. Many of the prisoners I speak to tell me that, they would enter the prison, for example, with 110 kilograms, they would leave with 60 or 50. I don't want to kind of present it as if the Israelis, are practicing this kind of insane violence today and that it's kind of breaks previous history. It doesn't. I think we were always marching towards that kind of reality with the Israeli regime.
Basil, it seems like what you're describing is that before October 7th, there were two kind of parallel carceral logics to the Israeli carceral regime, to the system of systematic imprisonment and the sadism and the torture that you're describing. One is the kind of surface level logic that I think we're familiar with in the United States of framing these acts as necessary defense of quote unquote national security. And that is really a justification built around Israeli nationalism and the threats to it. But the kind of reality of that system, right, is that there is an implicit logic, and that implicit logic is actually about Palestinian nationalism and about the forced denial of Palestinian nationalism. And what you've described, I think, is really powerful, that historically there has been a countercurrent to that, which is the political agency of the prisoner, of keeping alive the spirit of Palestinian nationalism through reclaiming rights within the bounds of the prison. And I think that too is a form of resistance that we're familiar with in the United States. But it seems like what you're describing is that since October 7th, that implicit logic of denying Palestinian nationalism has become explicit. It really struck me that you said that in the text of the prisoner execution bill, it names national motive. That is, in fact, naming Palestinian nationalism as the target of this legislation and making it explicit that the regime now, in this time of overt genocide, is about extinguishing Palestinian national identity. I wanted to ask you really about that agency that the prisoner holds, because the prisoner has long been central to Palestinian resistance. You mentioned the late 60s, and from the late 60s onward, resistance factions, both outside the prison, have used hijacking operations and abductions of Israeli soldiers as a method of freeing Palestinian prisoners, but also as a method of forcing Israel to recognize them, these factions, and their legitimacy as negotiating partners, etc. This, of course, culminated with October 7th itself, which was, a big operation to abduct soldiers and engage in a prisoner exchange. But also beyond the exchanges, too, the prisoner has played a very important symbolic role through resistance and through escape. I know you wrote about the escape from Gilboa prison. But I was just wondering if you could speak to us a little bit more about how the political subject of the prisoner has kept the Palestinian revolution alive over these various decades and different iterations of Israeli genocide and control.
Yeah, it's very true that the Palestinian prisoners movement have been central to the Palestinian struggle for liberation. Now, if we look, again, historically, we would see that many of the Palestinian leaders, of the national leaders, of the political leaders, in fact, today we still have, of course, political prisoners who are director generals of political parties inside Israeli prisons. So historically, the prisoners movement have been constituted by Palestinians who were actually resisting outside the prison. If we look at the second and first Intifada, for example, and different iterations of Palestinian kind of moments, these high moments of resistance against Israeli project, we would see the prison as, in the Israeli discourse, of course, it's a space where, there's an attempt to hide or put away, the people who are moving kind of the grounds outside the prison. And this explains why, historically, unionists, students, professors, activists, political leaders were continuously, if not, of course, executed, were continuously arrested and re-arrested, of course. It's an attempt to break the Palestinian struggle for liberation. One thing that the Israeli regime did not understand is that, the prison itself can become a breeding ground for future Palestinian fighters and future Palestinian people who engage in resistance. And I think, perhaps that's one of the, in my understanding, one of the ways in which the Palestinian prisoners movement have managed to convert itself into kind of a political, educational space where, generations after generations of Palestinians are engaging in education, in political education specifically. When they leave the prison, they're able to kind of, enroll in the struggle against Israeli Zionism. And I think this is why the prisoners movement is central, and it still is, of course, central to the Palestinian struggle for liberation. And just to give some examples here. There was an attempt, for example, to boycott Israeli military courts at different times throughout Palestinian history. And I think, when, of course, perhaps prisoners did not succeed in accomplishing the goals in the boycott, but they were telling the Palestinians outside the prison that we have to change the ways in which we treat Israeli military orders and Israeli courts, that we can actually boycott them, In a sense, they were telling us, those who are outside the prison, that to engage in struggle also means boycotting the legal structures of the occupation. That's just one example. The other example, of course, is hunger strikes, where throughout the Palestinian prisoners' history, the prisoners were attempting to not only assert their rights. I think there was something perhaps broader. They were trying to devise a political project that rids Israel, this Israeli regime, of its ability to criminalize Palestinian resistance and to treat Palestinians, the broader collective of Palestinians, as terrorists and criminals. And I think one of perhaps the most important accomplishments, where we can see this sense of political agency, is the assertion by Palestinian prisoners that they are not security prisoners. And that's why they engaged in these, different forms of struggle inside Israeli prisons. They were continuously telling the Israeli prison service and the Israeli government that they constitute a central part of a struggle for liberation, and they should be treated as such. Of course, Israel had never treated Palestinians as prisoners of war or as political prisoners. But I think the mere fact of highlighting that and centering that in all of the forms of resistance that we have witnessed since the beginning of Israel's carceral regime, it's saying that, Palestinian prisoners, first and foremost, they are a central component of the Palestinian struggle for liberation. But second, that they are not criminals, they're not terrorists. They actually, they constitute a political body that's engaged in struggle against this, settler colonial project, and that they should be treated as such. And I just want to read an example of that. I'll read an example of one of the statements of a political prisoner, Ahmad Saadat, who is currently in prison. He's the Director General of the Palestinian Front for the Liberation of Palestine, where he addressed one of the courts where he was supposed to stand. In his statement, he refused to accept the legitimacy of Israeli courts. And I want to read that quote because I think, it highlights my point, trying to kind of trace the history of the prisoners' movement, but also understanding why it's very central to our struggle for liberation and perhaps to the struggle against kind of defeat, against that notion of defeat that Israel continues to instill. In his statement, which he faced Israeli court, again, this is Ahmad Saadat, he said, "To start, I do not stand to defend myself in front of your court. I have already confirmed that I do not recognize the legitimacy of this court as it is an extension of the illegal occupation under international law, and as well as the legitimacy of our people's right to resist occupation, and that this court is based on the British emergency laws of 1945. And then he continues. He says, "I stand before this court again today as a mechanism for the suppression of our people and a tool of oppression that is unable to end the resistance and is an example of the inability of the occupation and its policies imposed on the people to do so." He continues, "Finally, I have already stressed in my previous statements from the so-called indictment to the trial that has been formulated, and now reiterate the same position after your court concluded, that this is a one-sided and farcical way to achieve its resolution under a mere image of a court. The convictions were known in advance, and they were predetermined by the terms of the political and security mechanisms, which is made legitimate by the court. And I think what Sadat is saying here is that, in a sense, the Israeli prison itself, the military laws that formulate the ways in which it functions, is a mere continuation of the Israeli tactics of control over the Palestinian people. And once we understand that, I think we can understand why Palestinian prisoners have continuously resisted. And in my research, I always try to say that Palestinian prisoners' attempts at resisting the carceral regime are effectively trying to formulate an emancipatory political project that takes us towards liberation and freedom. Because in their acts, they're in a sense kind of reformulating our relationship with the Israeli enemy. They're telling us that, these acts, when you think about smuggling letters, for example, when you think about hunger strikes, when you think about boycotting military courts, these are acts, of course, they have demands. But the demand is not simply to take that to kind of withdraw or to force the Israeli authorities to grant rights, but I think it's to assert something more important, which is that we are, in a political struggle against the Israeli regime, and that the Israeli attempts to depoliticize our experiences will never be able to bear fruit. And I think that's where we can trace the political agency of Palestinian prisoners. And here, if I may, I should also say, so that we don't think, perhaps I stressed the fact that today is very brutal and very violent, which is the case, inside Israeli prisons. But you would be surprised, actually, with the ways in which prisoners have managed to challenge, let's say, the Israeli authorities. And I say here challenge because I think the reality today is very different, again. But I want to give some examples so that we can understand why the prisoners' movement is that central to our struggle for liberation. In some of the interviews we conducted, the prisoners, again, as I described, they're placed in this total isolation. They have access to literally nothing in the cell. They would describe to me the ways in which they managed to create a chessboard, a chess game, out of bread, for example. Or the ways in which they were able to create cards to play with out of kind of the mere cardboard that would come into their cells and the guards would forget them. Another example is, and it's actually very brutal and violent, but it's of a doctor in the Gaza Strip who used a barbed wire from next to the tent where he was placed to create a medical equipment to treat a Palestinian detainee who was in a very brutal condition, of course, outside, the Israeli guards' gaze, but he managed to create this medical equipment to treat detainees and, in fact, save the lives of that particular detainee. A notable example that I always think about would help me in stressing my point. It's of a Palestinian prisoner who was sentenced for multiple life sentences. He had already spent 22 years in captivity before being released as part of one of the prisoners' exchange deals. He described to me the most important gift in his life. And this gift was, and as he told me the story, it was a birthday cake that his fellow detainees made out of, they saved the small amounts of bread and the meager spoon of jam that's provided to them once a week. A very, very small spoon of jam. It's the only source of sugar, as he described to me. They saved that amount of jam and created a cake. He said it was the most beautiful cake that was ever brought to him. Of course, he was arrested for 22 years. So since he was actually a youngster. And he goes on to describe that cake in a very eloquent way. Perhaps I would never be able to actually relay the ways in which he described it and the ways in which his comrades managed to create that syrup and to present it as a cake, but it was simply some pieces of bread that his comrades actually chose not to eat, even though they did not have enough bread and enough food, and to present to him on a day that he actually forgot he didn't know that it was his birthday.
Wow.
And as he described this to me, the story, he tells me that, for him, the Israeli jailers were continuously trying to break their spirits, were continuously trying to dehumanize them, to have them feel as if, they're inhumane, they're not humans actually, in the words he would describe. And for him, that was just one iteration not only of humanity, but of what a Palestinian prisoners movement means. And the way I read that story, actually, it's hinting at liberation and freedom. I think, in these, perhaps, Dylan, you were talking about the context of the US, but I think in these brutal spaces of violence, so not only in Palestine, of course, but in other places, it's these acts where detainees and those on the other receiving end of violence manage to kind of overcome not only the constant gaze of the jailer, but also to overcome, and I think this is crucial, the continuous attempt, and here I'm borrowing from Walid Daqqa, to mold our consciousness, to, in a sense, to re-engineer how we think and how we perceive things. And that act of overcoming that Israeli continuous attempts at depoliticizing our experiences is an example, I think, of that political agency. And most importantly, it's an example of what liberation and freedom might mean in the Palestinian context.
Basil, you've written about how, like many Palestinians, perhaps most Palestinians, this regime, this carceral regime that you're describing has impacted your family directly. Last fall, you wrote a piece titled, "My Father is One of Thousands Disappeared in Israel's Prisons," where you shared that your father has spent over 22 years in captivity. How has that shaped your personal academic trajectory? Is this experience something that is animating these questions that show up in your research?
Yes, even though I wouldn't like to recognize that, but I think it's clear that it has continuously affected the questions I ask and think about. For example, I described today the changes in the carceral regime, but I also remember these changes because in the past we were able to visit, for example, I remember the prison visitation rooms. I remember when my father was held in a very distant prison in the Naqab desert, for example, and the conditions were at a certain stage, we were actually what would be standing between us and the prisoners in the past, so this is perhaps like 15 years ago, was barbed wires. I remember, for example, being able at certain stage to touch my father's finger. And later on, seeing the changes were when the Israeli authorities installed double bulletproof glass in the visitation room, installed telephones that we were supposed to use for communication, and later on, of course, installed, and I remember this very clearly, a clock that ticks behind us as a reminder that our time, our 45 minutes that we granted for a visit is nearing its end. Obviously, the family experience itself has affected kind of, these questions, but I think most importantly, perhaps in my experience, is I think realizing that obviously my father and many of my family members were imprisoned, but I think it's realizing that, Israeli modes of violence, and this is very unfortunate, of course, but I think that's why we have to resist and seek the dismantling of this regime. It's that, we can see similar experiences and similar forms of violence in other parts of the world, similar stories and similar kind of pain that families endure, whether it's inside or outside prisons. And we can actually trace that back to Israel. And I think that's perhaps, in my academic journey is the most important, I think. It's noticing that, the stories of Palestinian detainees, even the stories I described to you, have manifestations outside Palestine. And I think that's kind of the brutal reality that the Israeli carceral regime and the Israeli, of course, Zionist regime more broadly had managed to instill through the exchange of weapons, of technologies, of surveillance technologies, of training militias in parts of the world where in a sense, Palestinians, the prisoners, and of course those outside the prisons have been turned into kind of subjects to practice with, to test these legal discourses that I described, and to try these methods of violence and torture. Images, for example, from El Salvador never escape my head, from El Salvador's CICOT, for example. Experiences that I had in Chile, where I visited the dictatorship's prisons and read about the forms of violence and torture that prisoners were subjected to. We see very painful and violent parallels between these kind of regimes. And, my family's history, I think, is just, of course, one example of that. But I think if we want to look broadly, I think that kind of hints at the urgency of tackling these questions. Because what Israel has been doing inside Israeli prisons, and of course, I'm sure the listeners here know the broader context of Israeli genocide, not only in Palestine, but of course in Lebanon and the violence in Syria and other parts of our region. It's that, this regime has perfected its modes of violence, its modes of torture. It has converted not only the prison, but the spaces outside. Then your question about the personal aspect. Now, as I'm speaking, I'm thinking about the realities not only of the prisoners, but actually of the thousands and thousands of families who have been cut off from any forms of communication with their loved ones, not knowing what their state, not knowing if they're alive or not knowing what they are enduring, just thinking about people who are placed in these near-death contexts of these brutal situations and not being able to hear from them or to visit them. I think by itself, it's very brutal. Not to mention, of course, the fact that Israel continues to withhold information with regards to dozens of Palestinian detainees that we do not know where they are, if they are actually detained or not, if they are martyred or not. And of course, the hundreds of bodies that Israel continues to withhold captive in its cemeteries and in its forensic institute, in refrigerators, basically. And I think that adds to that layer of violence, of course, the fact that today we're talking about the carceral regime, of course, but, it encompasses everything, really. When we think about, the families of the disappeared, for example, the families of the bodies who have been kidnapped, who were never returned, the families of the prisoners, the fact that a Palestinian who was arrested, for example, most certainly the Israeli security agency would not allow them to leave Palestine. That's another form of incarceration, I think.
You had mentioned the perfection of Israel's violent methods. I did want to go back to the conditions that detainees in Gaza have been going through, and in particular the situation at State Timan.
Yeah.
Of course, throughout all of this, you're talking about how the methods that Israel has been engaging in are a continuation of previous methods, intensification. But I wanted to ask two things in regards to this. One, to what degree are the conditions that Gaza detainees going through out of the ordinary, even for this continuation? And two, in regards to the response of Israeli society to the scandal, do you think that it would have been different prior to October 7th? Or were Israeli society to be, I hesitate to say this, to be exposed to it? I'm sure they're aware of it, but to be exposed to it at that level, would they have responded similarly then? To just completely say that everything that the Palestinians suffer is to be deserved because they're Nukhba terrorists or some other such?
So the conditions... actually, I'm going to just pull out something because I want to mention it here. Just as a side note, we're working on a book that we collected testimonies from nearly 30 Palestinian prisoners, and 10 of them are from the Gaza Strip. Hopefully, we will publish it soon. But the testimonies from Gaza are brutal. They're very, 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 very violent. I just want to kind of pull out one of the things that I want to mention because I keep thinking about it. Okay. During the beginning of the genocide, the Israeli regime kind of used, of course now it's an infamous place, used an Israeli military camp, Sidi Timan, as a detention center. At the beginning, of course, we had no information about this black hole where violations and torture were taking place continuously. And I'm sure perhaps if not, the listeners should look up some of the information, but I'm sure you recall the images of Palestinian detainees from Sidi Timan being forced to sit in a specific position. And this position was actually a continuous one. So the detainees in Sidi Timan were not allowed to move. They were forced to sit in that posture, so basically on the ground, on their knees, almost throughout the duration of the day, blindfolded, shackled throughout the whole time, not being allowed to move, not being allowed to talk to each other. The testimonies I collected from Palestinians, from detainees from the Gaza Strip who were released recently, they actually mentioned that very specifically, that they were not allowed to talk to any of their comrades. They were not allowed to move. Any movement would be subjected to violence. The detainees we spoke to described the presence of dogs in Sidi Timan. They described the brutal fashion in which the guards would force them continuously to sit in that still state and not provide them any water, not provide them food. Once they would tell me that if food was provided, they have to eat it. They cannot save any portion. Of course, it's very limited amount of food. They described the violence to which they were continuously subjected. They would describe, for example, the bathroom. The bathroom would serve around 120 detainees from the Gaza Strip, and this is Sidi Timan specifically. And believe it or not, they would be given, it's just one bathroom, they would be giving turns So the guards, as part of this policy, they would hand out numbers to the prisoners, allowing them to access the bathroom based on that number. So the first one would go, the second one, the third one. And they would describe to me that actually some of them would wait for a day to go to the bathroom. This is, of course, in addition to the fact that they were not allowed to bath. And if they were allowed to bath, it was just for once a week or 2 weeks. They were actually forced to bath in less than 3 to 4 minutes, to wear back the same clothes that they had. And here, I'm not clothes, I mean, just the prison uniform, which was granted to them later on, because at the beginning they were forced to dress what they described to me. One of them described to me this dress as our death penalty here, because we talked about death penalty. Our death penalty dress, the death penalty costume. This overhaul, this white overhaul that they were forced to dress. Another example, actually, I think brings to mind, of course, Nazi practices and other kind of fascist practices. The prisoners were given not only numbers, turns to go to the bathroom, but once they entered Sidi Timan, they were given a number that became their name. So they would describe to me that they would be called upon by their number. One of them actually, the guard asked, "What's your name?" So he said his name. He said, No, what's your name? He responded, his name. He asked him, he said, in the testimony 5 times. And then he asked, the detainee asked him, "What do you want my name to be?" He said, "Your number." And so this is, of course, in addition to the forms of violence that were present, but I think this nature of dehumanizing Palestinians to the extreme, turning the detainee into a mere number. Some of them described how their numbers were written on their back, for example, on a bracelet that they were given. Being called upon by your number, and they would say, my number is 73 or 74 or 76. In addition to the other forms of violence, I think that by itself is an attestation to that dehumanizing and that very violent forms of violence that was practiced on Palestinians. Now, of course, we have testimonies, prisoners would describe guards telling them when they arrived to Sidi Timan, or welcoming them with the phrase, "Welcome to hell." Even the guards themselves knew that it's, not only a black hole, but it's a legal black hole where they could practice any forms of violence they would feel like without any forms of punishment, any forms of accountability. And of course, this is why I think we have the story of the sexual assault, the gang rape, basically, of the Palestinian detainee that occurred in Sidi Timan. And I think, I'll go back to your other part of the question now. The reason why the case became important, and here just to say that numerous other prisoners were assaulted in Sidi Timan. And they described that assault. For example, the example I told you about the prisoner, he saw prisoners being forced to sit on a pole, for example, or, to perform sexual acts. A female guard who would smile and joke with another male guard while touching detainees' private parts, for example. That's sexual harassment, sexual assault that's omnipresent. It was omnipresent in Sidi Timan. But of course, the specific case of the sexual assault that managed to reach the media, I think it caused that sense of discussion just because it managed to reach the media. I think if it had not reached the public eye, nothing would have happened. And in fact, after that case, the Israeli guards and the Israeli regime continued these practices. I think it tells us something, actually, that particular case about the long history of sexual violence that the Israeli regime has continuously been practicing against Palestinian detainees. We've had numerous cases where Israeli guards and interrogators would sexually harass and violate Palestinian detainees, whether male or female, historically. And I think this case, it became a case because it managed to reach that public eye. But in my understanding, it did not create any change in the ways in which the Israelis view this matter. Most of the complaints that prisoners would file before the genocide to a committee that, Israeli committee that oversees and looks at allegations of assault and violence, has never turned out with prosecution for Israeli guards. There's a sense of impunity that's continuously granted to Israeli guards and Israeli interrogators. And the story of the Sidi Timan case as well, these guards are welcome. They're heroes for the Israeli public. They're not outcasts. And I think that's, again, tells us something about the nature of the Israeli regime. It has become so normal to brutalize Palestinians. Let's just, we're talking about the prison today, of course, right? But let's go out a bit, If we look at what happens on the checkpoints, for example, when a guard shoots a Palestinian who's walking by with a total sense of impunity, no forms of punishment or prosecution, albeit perhaps in a very kind of to appease the Israeli public, just very quickly, they would quickly be released out of the prison, the Israeli soldiers, for example. They never really face any serious prosecution or punishment. So I think that total sense of impunity is rampant in the Israeli public. And I think it justifies these forms of violence, including the Sadi Timan case, which is, again, it's very brutal, right? The fact that these guards just took the prisoner to the side and assaulted him. But again, it's the nature of this carceral regime to practice these forms of violence, to practice these forms of torture against Palestinian bodies. It has become so naturalized, so legalized, and of course, practiced with total impunity by the Israeli government and its, of course, judiciary.
I wanted to ask a little bit more about the hunger strike movement, which we touched on a little bit. I remember a few years ago the case of Khadr Adnan, who was killed in prison because of the hunger strike that went on for, I want to say, close to 80 days. I don't have the exact number in front of me. But the thing that I remember about Adnan before his death was that he continuously spoke about the importance of the hunger strike. I think the way that he described it at one point was saying that freedom could be won through the intestine or something along those lines. But the way in which he spoke of it, it was clearly this lamentation that the power of the hunger strike had deteriorated in some years. Could you speak about what the movement was like, how it, I guess, deteriorated, what power it currently has now, if any?
Yeah, I'll start from the end, actually. Today, I think during the current conditions, I've heard of some cases of detainees attempting to go on hunger strike, but I think in the current conditions, because of the forms of Israeli violence and torture that's rampant, we do not hear about hunger strikes. Perhaps, prisoners don't see this as a moment of, engaging in hunger strikes at this particular moment. But historically, so before the genocide, yes, it was one of the most important tools and tactics that prisoners engaged with to demand their rights. As I mentioned, one of the earliest hunger strikes in the late 60s and 70s actually began establishing what the prisoners' movement would look like, began, in a sense, setting the terms of the relationship between the guards, the Israeli jailers, and the detainees. Prisoners have engaged in numerous collective, and I say collective here because this is, I think where your question is geared towards. They were engaged in numerous collective hunger strikes where thousands of prisoners would embark collectively and simultaneously in a hunger strike demanding specific rights. But at a particular period, and I think your reference to Khadr Adnan is important, many of the Palestinian detainees who were specifically under Israel's administrative detention policy, which is a policy that allows the Israeli government, of course it dates back to the British colonial mandate, it allows the Israeli government to detain any Palestinian arbitrarily without charge or without putting them to trial and to hold them indefinitely. So many of the detainees would embark on an individual hunger strike to demand their liberation, so to demand an end for the administrative detention order. Khadr Adnan was one of them. He engaged in multiple hunger strikes, of course, collectively, but also on an individual basis, in a sense, to force the Israeli authorities to grant him his liberation, because the premise of his hunger strike was that this detention is illegal, that the Israelis have no cause for his arrest, and that either they would, sentence him or they would release him. Of course, as you mentioned, in May 2023, he was martyred while he was on hunger strike. And he, in a sense, continued his legacy of hunger striking and trying to shed light on the struggle of administrative detainees because of the nature of the detention order, which again is arbitrary, it's illegal, and of course today it's practiced across the board. I mean, we see a rise in the use of this detention policy across Palestine today. Now, the second part of the question, if it declined, right? Or if it's...
deteriorated, declined.
Yes. Yeah. So I wouldn't say it deteriorated. I think it was always in Palestinian, throughout Palestinian prisoners' history, the recourse to hunger strikes was always, a calculated decision. And now I'm talking about the collective hunger strikes. It's calculated because the sets of demands has to be clear. There must be at a certain stage a negotiation with the carceral authorities. So it's always a strategic tactic, right? It's perhaps one of the last recourse, because to put your life in that state also, it's very brutal and violent to the body. But I think throughout history, it was at moments where demands had to be met. Now, this did not mean that demands were always met, because as we again know, the Israeli authorities and the Israeli regime has always practiced violence against hunger strikers. I mentioned one example, Abdul Qadir Abu al-Fahim, who was the first martyr. He was force-fed. By the way, we spoke about the death penalty. Israel had also tried to push forward laws to force-feed Palestinian prisoners, to force-feed them specifically to end the practice of hunger strikes. This was another legal attempt where, the Israelis thought that they would be able to kind of break that resisting spirit through, force feeding Palestinian prisoners, again, dressed in a garb of, we care about their lives and their humanity. So again, I wouldn't say it deteriorated, rather that, it emerged at a certain moment of Palestinian history where the conditions were dire. For example, another notable example is the hunger strike. The multiple ones, of course, but the hunger strikes that were undertaken in protest of the solitary confinement of Palestinian prisoners, where detainees were placed in solitary confinement for years. And actually, this one did succeed to kind of release some of the prisoners from solitary confinement.
Wow. That's very powerful, especially because we've seen similar tactics and similar successes in the United States around solitary. I wanted to perhaps close us out by asking you directly about someone you've mentioned multiple times in your answers to these questions, and that is Walid Daqqa, who, Walid Daqqa, a Palestinian revolutionary and writer who spent 38 years of his life incarcerated before he was martyred in prison in 2024, and in fact is still incarcerated. His body is still being held, as you mentioned, by the Israelis. In a piece titled Parallel Time, Cultural Production from the Small Prison to the Large Prison, you wrote, along with your co-author, the prison, both material and metaphorical, extends beyond the confines of captivity and has mirrored itself in Palestinians' divisions in myriad spatial and temporal configurations. Daqqa describes a fragmented Palestinian reality, emerging from numerous failed promises to warn, how can one ensure that the deconstruction of Palestinian identity does not take place as it grows in these opposing temporal and spatial contexts? Can you explain for us the concept of the small prison and the large prison and how it can fragment Palestinian identity? And then on top of that, how can Palestinians resist that fragmentation?
Yeah, perhaps there's a constant metaphor in Walid Daqqa's writing where he tries to understand in his numerous writings the reality of confinement, the reality of captivity, and to link it to the broader kind of Israeli attempts and control tactics outside the prison. Again, as you mentioned, he was arrested for 38 years. So in his writings, he has that also attempt to think about the situation outside the Israeli prisons. And just to think about that long duration of captivity, of course, by itself is something, I think. By the small and the large prison, he's making reference here to the physical space of confinement, which is the prison itself. The small prison, let's call it that way, to borrow from Walid. And the large prison is, again, the carceral tactics that Israel has put in place to control and to confine the Palestinian populations. And I think in that metaphor itself, we would be able to understand the carceral logic of the Israeli regime, where we can see actually that the prison, the physical space of the prison, mirrors what takes place outside captivity. One of the questions before was about the Gaza Strip and the detainees from the Gaza Strip. And I think that's another example, a very good illustration of what Walid Daqqa means here, perhaps. If we look at the Gaza Strip, how it was confined and still is confined, converted into what many would refer to as, a large open-air prison, and to link it to the ways in which Palestinians today are starved, they're denied medical care, that they are brutalized, violated, and to see how the context, of course, over the past 2 decades, how the Gaza Strip similarly was actually not only, converted into this physical space of confinement where Palestinians were not able to leave or enter the Gaza Strip, but actually their rations of food were controlled, their calories were controlled, where violence was directed from above and controlled as well, such in a very similar fashion to what takes place inside Israeli prisons today and to what has taken place inside Israeli prisons in the past. We would see that resemblance, I think. The fact that Israel, when we think about, and I think this is important to note, that, the Israeli prison system or the carceral regime, how we describe it, it's not simply the act of detaining Palestinians. And that's what Walid Daqqa is talking about. It's not simply placing one in captivity. It's what comes with that arrest and detention. It's that attempt to, he would use the term molding consciousness, in an attempt to kind of break you away from that broader Palestinian social and political collective and to assert a deep political subject, in a sense, depoliticize the subjectivity of the prisoners. And I think we see this resemblance across the board, where Israel has put in place its technological apparatus to convert and to turn our realities, even outside the physical space of captivity, into this kind of carceralized locations where our daily life is controlled, where we are monitored all the time, where, our freedom of movement, restrictions on travel, as I mentioned, the Gaza Strip is a perfect illustration. And I think that's where, that's kind of the beginning of trying to understand that metaphor of the small and the large prison. Again, viewing Palestine as a broader carceral location where actually carcerality and the act of incarceration itself is central to understanding the carceral regime and to understanding how Israel functions through its tactics of control and violence. Now, the other part of the question here, you asked about a specific text where Walid Daqqa wrote this text in parallel time, where he described, it was in 2006 where he, was trying to marked actually the first day of his 20th year in prison. He uses these kind of metaphors, the parallel time and the other kind of concepts that he puts in place, just to warn us, I think, and this is the second part of the question, Dylan, to warn us that, Israeli violence, Israeli torture, again, is not simply intended to detain or to kill Palestinians. There's a broader context to that violence. It's to bring about a new Palestinian subject, a subject that's depoliticized, that does not engage in resistance, where Israel manages to instill its kind of discourse upon that new subject in a way. And in his writings, he's trying to warn us of that danger. The quote you read is specifically about the post-Oslo era in Palestine, where fragmentation has become, in a sense, the norm. And it's a warning that what takes place inside prisons might actually become, the reality outside the prison space, and vice versa, of course. And I think that's why Walid Daqqa is very important here, because his writings are perhaps a reading of, what might become if the Israeli project succeeds. But at the same time, his writings are an assertion. It is possible, his life itself is an attestation to that. It's possible to not be molded by Israeli power, to not allow Israeli power after 38 years of captivity to break that fighting spirit in Walid Daqqa. And again, here I'm mentioning this not to romanticize the experiences of Palestinian prisoners, rather to assert the fact that, the long history of Palestinian writing from captivity and engagement in resistance practices is simply, an attestation of Walid Daqqa is telling us, I think, saying that it is possible to think otherwise. It is possible to break that cycle of violence that Israel has continuously been enforcing upon us, and to think of a political project that gears us towards true liberation and justice, I think.
I think there's something extremely powerful there and extremely prescient and is extremely harrowing, which is that, you mentioned he's writing this in 2006, which is really at the onset of the siege of Gaza. Mm. And I find a lot of echoes of that thought, that conceptualization of the large prison as the state of being besieged. And Gaza is the example of that, really present in the statements and speeches of Yahya Sinwar that he's making in the years leading up to October 7th. And that formulation of the large prison being the state of broader captivity. and the insistence in Sinwar and in the active resistance and revolution to not let that win, to maintain a sense of agency and Palestinian nationalism and to hold on to that national consciousness, even when the consequences of that are totally devastating. Basil, thank you so much. This has been a difficult at times, but extremely informative and important conversation. So I really appreciate it.
On the contrary, thanks to you and for the opportunity. And we hope to see the day where our prisoners are liberated, and those in other parts of the world also who face similar situations and contexts of violence. Thank you.
Inshallah ta'ala.
Inshallah.